In the spring of 1986, a woman named Denise Paulson from rural Wichita Falls, Texas, claims she woke up mid-procedure. Not from a dream, not from surgery, from what she describes as a structured, deliberate examination conducted by extraterrestrial beings, what researchers have come to call, in clinical shorthand, the Gray procedure. She wasn't supposed to be conscious, she wasn't supposed to remember, but she did. And what she saw in that room didn't just change her life, it may change how we understand contact entirely. Let me be clear about what the Gray procedure is, or what it's claimed to be, before we go any further. Across decades of abduction testimony collected from hundreds of witnesses across North America, Western Europe, and parts of Southeast Asia, a consistent sequence of events emerges with what I can only describe as uncomfortable regularity. The subject is taken, typically from a bedroom or vehicle. They are brought to an enclosed space, described variously as a room, a chamber, a bay. They are placed on a surface, they are examined. They do not, in most documented cases, regain full consciousness during the process. Denise Paulson did. And that single deviation, that one crack in the pattern, is where everything begins to get complicated. She was 31 years old in April of 1986. She'd had, by her own account, and by the account of those close to her, no prior interest in extraterrestrial phenomena, no history of sleep disorders, no psychiatric flags, no documented engagement with UFO communities of any kind. I want to stress this not because it proves anything, it doesn't, but because it matters for context. The profile of the convinced believer is well worn and easy to dismiss. Denise Paulson didn't fit it, not before April 14th. What she describes happening that night began, as so many of these accounts do, with a light, not a dramatic light, not a beam descending from the sky in a field. A light at the edge of her bedroom window, peripheral, almost gentle, that she initially assumed was a truck passing on Route 9. She remembers thinking that. She remembers the specific thought. Then she remembers nothing, and then she remembers everything. And the gap between those two states is where I've spent the better part of 2 years. She came back to consciousness, her word, in a position she describes as slightly reclined, not quite lying flat, on a surface that she remembers as smooth and cool and faintly luminescent. The room around her was not dark. It was lit, she says, from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. No visible source, no shadows, which she found, even in that moment of disorientation, deeply wrong. Rooms have shadows, she told the researcher who first documented her account in October of 1987. That room had none. And that's where Denise Paulson becomes impossible to ignore. The beings she describes align, in broad strokes, with what thousands of other witnesses have described independently since at least the 1950s. Tall, thin, with large cranial structures, elongated limbs, and eyes that she characterizes not as black, as popular culture has conditioned us to expect, but as dark amber, almost golden. She mentioned the eye color in her very first account, before she'd consumed any significant volume of abduction literature. That detail was not, in 1986, part of the established visual grammar of alien contact. The standard grey, black-eyed extraterrestrial aesthetic had become culturally dominant. Amber eyes were not part of the script. Why would she invent a detail that contradicted the consensus hallucination, if we're assuming this is a hallucination? There were 3 of them, she says. 2 positioned at either side of the surface she lay on. 1 standing further back, near, and here is the first anomaly that stopped me cold. What she describes as a secondary wall. A wall with a seam, a door that was not like the other features of the room, a door that appeared to lead somewhere else. She wasn't supposed to see it, she's certain of that. The moment she turned her head toward it, the moment her consciousness apparently registered enough to direct her own gaze, the being nearest to her responded. Not with alarm, with something she describes as adjustment, a recalibration, as though her waking were a technical problem being quietly corrected rather than a crisis, that response, that measured procedural response to her consciousness. That is what I keep returning to. Denise Paulson's case was first formally documented in the files of a private research group operating out of Albuquerque, New Mexico, called the Contact Continuity Project, a small underfunded body of researchers working in the late 1980s to cross-reference abduction testimony with a level of methodological rigor that, frankly, most of the field hadn't bothered with. The BCP, no longer operates. Its records, according to the two former associates I was able to locate, were partially transferred to a private archive in 1994. And partially, and this is where the official explanation breaks down entirely, simply lost. Not misfiled, not donated, lost. The lead researcher on the Paulson case was a man named Dr. Raymond Achebe, a former cognitive psychologist from the University of New Mexico who had grown disillusioned with what he called the reflexive debunking culture of mainstream academia. Achebe spent 14 months working directly with Denise, conducting over 60 hours of recorded interview sessions, cross-referencing her account with 37 other witness testimonies from the same approximate 18-month window, January 1985 through June 1986, that he gathered from across the continental United States. And here's where the pattern begins. Achebe found that of his 37 comparative cases, 11 independently described a secondary structure within the room. A seam, a division, a door that wasn't the door they'd come through. Witnesses in Flagstaff, Arizona, in Duluth, Minnesota, in a small town outside of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, whose name I've agreed not to use. None of these people had spoken to each other. None of them had, by any verifiable account, been exposed to Denise Paulson's testimony at the time they gave their own. 11 people describing the same door. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision, and no one in the decades since has asked the obvious question loudly enough. What is behind it? I want to read you something. Not from Denise, from a man named Carol Vick, a retired electrician from Duluth who filed his account with the CIMP in March of 1986, 6 weeks before Denise's experience. He describes, quote, and I'm paraphrasing his written statement here, a room within a room. He used that exact phrase, a room within a room. He said it felt administrative. That word was his, administrative, like what was happening to him in the outer chamber was not the main event, like the main event was happening somewhere he wasn't allowed to see. I went further into Achebe's notes, what survives of them, and found that he had flagged this same language across multiple testimonies, not room within a room verbatim, but the concept, the sense of a visible procedure masking an invisible one, the sense of being in the anteroom of something larger. What are we to do with that? I'm not prepared to tell you these people are lying. I'm not prepared to tell you they're telling the truth. What I am prepared to say is that the consistency of this particular detail, unprompted, uncoordinated, across dozens of separate accounts, spanning different states, different demographics, different years, is not something I can explain away with the vocabulary of coincidence. Let me come back to Denise, because I've been circling it, and I think that's appropriate. The way you circle something that has weight to it, that you're not entirely sure you're ready to approach directly. But we have to approach it. That's why we're here. She broke free. Not physically. She's careful about this distinction, and I think the distinction matters. She didn't overpower anyone. She didn't run. What she means by broke free is that her consciousness fully surfaced without permission, at a moment that appeared to catch the beings off guard. For a period she estimates that between 30 seconds and 2 minutes she acknowledges the uncertainty. She doesn't pretend otherwise. She was fully awake, fully aware, and entirely unattended. The two beings at her sides had moved. The third, the one near the secondary door, had moved toward the others. Her head was free to turn. She turned it toward the door. It was open. Not wide open. Partially. Maybe, she says, the width of a human shoulder. And through that partial opening, in the light that was different from the light in the outer room, warmer, she says, more concentrated, almost amber in a way that reminded her of the eyes, she saw something that she has spent nearly 40 years attempting to articulate to the satisfaction of people like me. She saw what she believes were other surfaces, other tables, other subjects. She couldn't see faces. The angle was wrong. The gap was too narrow. The light was both revealing and obscuring in ways she struggles to describe. But the shape of a figure on a surface is not a complex shape. It is recognizable. And she says she recognized it multiple times, multiple figures, multiple surfaces, in a space that appeared from her narrow vantage point to be considerably larger than the room she was in. And then the door closed and the recalibration continued, and the next thing she remembers is her bedroom floor and her cat sitting 3 feet away, watching her with what she describes as unusual stillness. The silence was deafening. I spoke to a woman I'll call Margaret. She asked that her surname not be used, who had her own experience in the summer of 1987 near Sedona, Arizona. Margaret was a school teacher at the time. She'd never heard of Denise Paulson. She described in an account filed independently with a researcher named Patricia Folds at the University of Arizona's now defunct Anomalous Experience Research Unit, the same partial awakening, the same sense of procedure. And then she said something that I've been unable to stop thinking about. She said the beings seemed less interested in her than in something they were preparing her for. Less interested in her than in something they were preparing her for. I asked her to explain that. She said it was a feeling, not a fact. She said it felt like she was, and she paused for a long moment before this word, staged, like the examination was not the culmination of the event, like she was being made ready for a second context, a different room, a different process, and that the interruption of her consciousness, her involuntary awakening, had disrupted a sequence before it reached its completion. Was Denise Paulson supposed to go through that door? Is that the question we've been failing to ask? I want to talk about what we don't have, because in investigations like this one, absence is as informative as presence. Dr. Raymond Achebe filed a preliminary report with the Contact Continuity Project in early 1988, a document that several of his former colleagues confirm existed, that was circulated within a small network of researchers, and that reportedly included a cross-referenced analysis of the secondary room testimonies alongside what Achebe described in correspondence as physiological markers of interrupted transition. I've been trying to obtain that report for 18 months. It appears to exist in reference only. Every physical and digital trace of it leads to a dead end. The Xamuste Pease archive, partial as it was reportedly transferred in 1994 to a private collector in Santa Fe, whose identity I have not been able to conclusively establish. 2 former CCP associates described this transfer to me independently, with slightly different details, but both confirmed it happened, and both confirmed that by 1995, attempts to contact or access that archive were met with. They used different words, but the meaning was the same. A kind of total quiet. Not denial, not refusal, just quiet. No response. As if the address had never existed. The evidence suggests something much larger is at stake in the preservation or the erasure hakabai of these particular records. Not the abduction accounts themselves, which are voluminous and freely accessible, but the pattern work, the cross-referencing, the work that began to suggest that the individual accounts were nodes in a larger structure. That specific work is what vanishes. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. First, the researcher loses institutional support, then the documentation becomes inaccessible. Then the researcher himself recedes, not dramatically, not in ways that invite attention, but quietly, incrementally, until the work they were doing exists only in the memories of people like the 2 former CCP associates who agreed to speak with me, off record, and who both separately, in different cities, in different conversations, used the same phrase when I asked them what they thought Achebe had found. They said, "Too much of it matched. Too much of it matched." What does that mean? It means that when you lay Denise Paulson's account next to Carol Vick's account, next to Margaret's account, next to the Baton Rouge testimony, next to the 11 cases from Achebe's comparative study, the overlap is not the overlap of shared cultural mythology or media contamination or collective hysteria. The overlap is structural, procedural. It is the overlap of people describing the same event from the same limited vantage point, with the same gaps, the same partial view through the same partial door. Once you see it, you can't look away. There's one more detail from Denise's account that I've saved for here because it didn't make sense to me until I started cross-referencing, and once it made sense, I wished it hadn't. The light through the door, the warmer light, the amber light. She mentioned it almost in passing in her first documented session with Achebe. It wasn't flagged in the original transcript as significant. I found it because I was reading carefully, looking for the small things, the things that don't announce themselves, the amber light. I went back through the 11 secondary room testimonies in Achebe's comparative study, the fragments that survived, the second-hand summaries that former colleagues could reproduce from memory. In 7 of the 11, there is a reference to a light quality that is distinct from the primary room. Different, warmer, described in at least 3 accounts with colour language in the amber to gold range. 7 out of 11. In a study of experiences that, if we accept the mainstream explanation, are elaborate shared hallucinations, is there a mechanism by which 7 unconnected people hallucinate the same specific quality of light, the same warmth, the same amber? This raises a simple but critical question. Are they describing a feature of an experience, or are they describing a feature of a place? Because if it's a place, if that light is a real quality of a real room that a real number of people have glimpsed through a real, partially open door, then we are not talking about psychology. We are not talking about hypnagogic imagery or sleep paralysis or stress-induced confabulation. We are talking about architecture. We are talking about a room that exists, a room with a particular quality of light. A room that Denise Paulson may have been about to enter in April of 1986 before her consciousness surfaced and interrupted the sequence. A room we have never been able to account for. And here's the strangest part, the detail that I keep turning over, that I've turned over more times than I can count in the 2 years I've been working on this. Denise doesn't describe fear when she talks about the light through the door. She describes other things, disorientation, strangeness, the animal alertness of a person in a situation they cannot categorize. But the light itself, she describes it as familiar. She cannot explain why. She has no memory of having seen it before. But in the moment, looking through that partial gap, at the amber warmth of a room she was not supposed to see, she says it felt, and she always pauses before this word. She always seems to be checking whether she means it. She says it felt like recognition. I've spent 2 years on this. I want to be honest about where it leaves me. I came in skeptical. I remain skeptical in the technical sense. I have not proven anything. I cannot prove anything. And the nature of this territory is such that proof may be permanently beyond reach. But skepticism properly practiced is not the same as dismissal. Skepticism is the sustained willingness to answer the question that hasn't been asked yet. And after 2 years, here are the questions I cannot stop asking. If these experiences are fabrications, manufactured by trauma, by cultural absorption, by the mysterious generative capacity of the sleeping brain, why does the fabrication include a room we don't know about? Why invent an additional space? Why not simply report the procedure and stop there, as the vast majority of accounts in fact do? What does the mind gain by adding a door? If these experiences are real, if something is happening to people in rooms with no shadows and amber-lit secondary chambers, what is behind that door? What is the procedure that the procedure is a preparation for? What were they making Denise Paulson ready for? And why, of all the things to forget, of all the details that dissolve in the acid of whatever cognitive process brings people back from these experiences, why do so many people remember the light? The documentation is gone or going or has been made very quiet. Achebe's pattern work exists now primarily in fragments and in the memories of two aging researchers who asked me, before we spoke, whether I was recording. The Contact Continuity Project is dissolved. The Anomalous Experience Research Unit at the University of Arizona was defunded in 1991, 2 years after Margaret's account was filed there, defunded in the middle of a study without completing its data analysis, without publishing its findings, without archiving its materials in any publicly accessible repository. Work stops. Records vanish. Researchers recede. And somewhere, in the surviving fragments of 60 hours of recorded conversation between Raymond Achebe and Denise Paulson, there is a moment, I know it's there because Achebe's former colleague described it to me, almost word for word, where Denise stops speaking mid-sentence, where she goes quiet for a long time. And then, very quietly, she asks Achebe a question that he apparently could not answer, that no one has adequately answered since. She asks, what happened to the others? Not what happened to her. What happened to the others, the shapes on the other surfaces, the figures in the amber light, the ones who did not wake up early, the ones who completed the sequence, the ones who went through the door? Where are they? What do they know now that we don't? What did they see on the other side of that light? And why is the silence around that question so total, so seamless, so complete, that it feels less like an absence of answers and more like an answer in itself? I don't know. But I notice that I've stopped being able to sleep near windows, and I notice that when I do sleep, I check. First thing upon waking, whether the room has shadows. It always does, so far.